But I wanted to welcome all of you here today to our session titled LGBTQIA Fair Housing Protections and Toolkit Preview. My name is Julia Jones and I work for Root Policy Research. We will be previewing today a forthcoming HUD training toolkit that will focus on new protections for LGBTQIA folks under the Fair Housing Act. That was developed by Root Policy Research and Apt Associates. Today I have with me the brains of the operation. So we have Heidi Agler, who is one of the founders and managing directors of Root Policy Research. Root Policy is a female-owned consulting firm out of Denver, specializing in housing policy and research. We do a lot of work throughout Colorado and the United States. Jessica Lurs is joining us all the way from Pittsburgh. She is a senior associate for the Social and Economic Policy Division at Apt Associates. She has over 17 years of working in the human services field. She has experience both working directly with unhoused populations, as well as currently she provides technical assistance to clients throughout the country. So as part of this session, we thought it would be a good idea to open with a little bit of polling, primarily because the Fair Housing Act doesn't necessarily fall under the purview of all of planners' jobs, so we wanted to get a sense of who's in the room and what our collective understanding of the Fair Housing Act is. So thank you all for participating in the conference app. How familiar are you with the Fair Housing Act? And we had everything from, I've heard of it, but I don't quite understand exactly what it does or how it's implemented, which is largely what we'll be talking about today. We also had a lot of folks say, I can recite all of the protected classes by memory, so you're very familiar with the Fair Housing Act. And we had one person who said, what is the Fair Housing Act? And I don't have your name, so I can't point you out. The second question was, how many states explicitly prohibit housing discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity? So this was prior to when these classes were covered under federal law, and how many states took it upon themselves to provide protections for these populations at the state level. You all got it right. There's 23 states that have adopted explicit prohibitions on housing discrimination for these groups. Next, we had a bit of a trick question, which is when did discrimination based on gender identity and sexual orientation become protected under the Fair Housing Act? Most folks thought it was in 2012 when Obama was elected, but it was actually in 2021. This is fairly recent. I'll let Heidi get into the details of how this came about and sort of the legal background to it. And then 1968 is actually when the Fair Housing Act itself was enacted. The final poll question was, name all of the protected classes that you are aware of. You all nailed it and got most of them. So we have age, gender, sex, race, elderly, gender again, disability, ability. I think religion was also in there. So you all covered it. They're not all showing up here on the screen now, unfortunately. We think, first of all, thank you all for participating in the poll. We think this training will really provide tools and resources for us as planners to be more inclusive in our communities, our processes, and in our own offices. So with that, I'm going to pass it on to Heidi, and she's going to get us started with the agenda and give us some background on the toolkit itself.
Great, thank you, Julia. It's so nice to see everybody. I'm happy to, I was at a conference a couple weeks ago in person, which was my first one, and I don't know, 2.5 years, and it was really fun. So I hope you're having a good time. It's great to see everybody. I realized this morning I'm not actually officially on the program, so I feel a little bit like a party crasher here. We had initially hoped that we would get a lawyer to help somebody who had defended one of the critical LGBTQIA cases to speak. There's one that I'll talk about that happened in Boulder County, and lawyers are super busy people. Maybe some of you are lawyers too, and you know that lawyers are super busy people. So we were unsuccessful getting a lawyer, so I'm going to play a lawyer for this first part, but I just want to clarify, I'm not a lawyer, so you're not getting CLE credits, unfortunately, and you might want to fact check me a little bit. Our purpose today is to talk about this new protection, and it's kind of confusing how it came about, so I'll walk you through it very slowly. Julia's going to talk about inclusive language, and so the practical side of implementing the protection. And Jessica is going to talk also about the practical aspects of sort of what does this mean in the day of the life. Really our objective here is to arm you with information that you can bring to your communities. If you are a lawyer, you represent property owners to help you comply. This is federal law now. And then expose you to some training that's going to be coming out that HUD will be revealing in hopefully the next couple months. But I wanted to start with this first bullet here just gives you a sense of, Julia said how new this is, and this is very, very new. In January 2021, following a 2020 U.S. Supreme Court decision, which found the protected class of sex to include sexual orientation and gender identification, an executive order that was put forth by the Biden administration formally declared fair housing protections to include sexual orientation and gender identification. And I'll talk you through how that happened in just a moment. Did I go? Oh, I couldn't tell if I went forward. This toolkit that's going to be revealed that we've been working on with Jessica's team from Apt Associates is going to be a comprehensive training on legal protections and best practices that support the implementation of fair housing related activities for LGBTQIA plus people. It's meant for a variety of audiences. So if you are a resident, if you're a renter, you want to know what your rights are, if you're applying for a loan and you want to know what your rights are, there will be aspects of that tool that will be really useful. If you are a lawyer, you're representing property owners, there will definitely be aspects of that tool that are really useful. If you work for the public sector and you want to understand how this comes into play with housing policy, the toolkit will be really useful as well. So we're going to give you a sense of little preview of what that looks like. It's organized by modules that really speak to individual professions, and you can see those as a standalone. There'll be videos that'll be associated with each of the modules, so it's really cool, and I'm looking forward to seeing that roll out. One question that you might be thinking is, if you didn't know that this was a protection, wow, you're surprised that it's that new, but you might be wondering how often does this type of discrimination occur? You may have experienced it yourself and feel like, well, yeah, this happens pretty often, but I don't hear much about it. And the reason that you haven't heard much about it is because LGBTQIA status was not recognized as a federal protected class until recently. Federal organizations that enforce fair housing wouldn't have been collecting data on how frequently this occurs. So the data would be collected at the state level if state's good at enforcing their protection, but really we didn't know a whole lot about how often this type of discrimination was happening until a couple research studies came out over the last decade. And I would caution you, this research is more common these days. There have been a number of additional studies that have come out, and it's really very much evolving. So there's some data that suggest that, for example, same-sex couples, when applying for mortgages, don't face high levels of denial. There are others that suggest that they do. And so I would definitely say this is an area that's evolving, something to pay attention to. These three research studies here give you a sense of how often they're finding that discrimination occurs. It definitely is there. It's happening, but we don't have time series data or a real track record of understanding how frequently it's going on, particularly in lower income communities who tend to be and certainly cultural specific communities who tend to report this information less frequently or even know what their rights are. So to dive into some of the legal aspects of this, I'm going to talk a bit about the Fair Housing Act. I'll talk about some of the HUD protections covered under rules, and then talk about the executive orders that made this fair housing protection real. And I'm also going to end with a case called Bostock versus Clayton County. This was the Supreme Court Act. It's pretty interesting and that led to this new protection. So first, a little bit about the Fair Housing Act. Some of you said you know some about it. Some said not at all. This was signed into law in 1968. It was part of the Federal Civil Rights Act. It was a follow-on part of the Federal Civil Rights Act. Initially, it prohibited discrimination based on race, color, religion, national origin, sex, just the term sex, but not disability or familial status. I guess people didn't realize that there was discrimination on the basis of disability or familial status at that time. There still is today. So that came later. That was an amendment that added disability and familial status. There's a lot of different transactions that are covered under the Fair Housing Act. I won't go into a lot of detail there. But some Housing Act and some examples that are certainly you see in the communities in which we work, that we hear about. Intentional refusal to rent or show housing because of LGBTQIA status. So I'm a housing provider. I just said, look, you're a same-sex couple. It's against my beliefs to rent to you. I don't want to rent to you. Your family composition makes me nervous. I'm not going to rent to you. That's illegal. Steering, so I may, as a real estate agent, or maybe I'm a property owner, I've got rental property in 2 different neighborhoods, I may steer my clients or potential renters to a neighborhood that I think they might feel more comfortable living in because there are a lot of same-sex couples there. Or that neighborhood is known as being one where gay people are comfortable. That's steering. That's also illegal. Intentional unequal terms or conditions because of LGBTQIA status. So I quote you a higher rent. I tack fees onto your rent. That's real common still for children, for families with children. That's also a violation of the Fair Housing Act. And then harassment, so creating a hostile environment, verbal harassment, name calling would also be illegal. We have a case in Boulder County in Colorado that occurred that is a pretty easy case to understand, that before this protection was added at the federal level was found to be illegal on both federal and by federal and state law. It's a case called Smith versus Avanti. A landlord thought about renting to a same-sex couple, 2 women, one of whom was a transgender woman, showed them the property, agreed to rent them, or sort of tentatively agreed to rent them the unit, and then changed her mind. And she changed her mind because she felt that renting to this couple would compromise her status within the community. And she used the term their unique relationship. They sued, and they actually won. And that became, that was one of the first really high-profile cases that took a look at that term sex and whether or not that meant also sexual orientation or gender identification. In this case, this couple had both covered. So leading up to, I'm going to walk you through some of the memos and a little bit of a kind of backward way of doing this to get a sense of how this all came to about because it's not super straightforward. In 2012 and 2016, there were a number of rules, which we'll just call the Equal Access Rule, and these applied initially to HUD programs or HUD-funded or HUD-insured loans. So if there's public dollars, federal dollars in the program, federal dollars in that mortgage loan, then that provider would fall under the Equal Access Rule. This required programs to be open to all individuals regardless of sexual orientation or gender identity or marital status, which is not covered under federal law, and then prohibited lenders from denying HUD-insured mortgages to qualified applicants. The CPD rule, that stands for the Community Planning and Development, so they oversee HUD programs to cities, counties, and states. This also was addressed through housing shelters and services. So this is pretty common. The federal government almost kind of tests the waters. Oftentimes they'll roll out a more progressive step with something like fair housing within their programs just to see how it works, to test the waters, to try and include a little more fairness in that way. So in 2021, the big step that came from HUD was a memo that followed the Bostock ruling, the Supreme Court ruling in 2020. This was issued directly in response to Bostock and is an executive order I'll talk about. And this said to FHEO is the the Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity offices within HUD. They're responsible for enforcing the Fair Housing Act. And it directed them to file and investigate all complaints of sex discrimination that include discrimination based on gender identity and sexual discrimination. So before that, as I said, the reason we don't have a lot of data or a lot of time series data on discrimination with LGBTQIA individuals is because HUD didn't have to keep it. It wasn't covered under federal law. That changed with that memo in 2021. And this also applies, HUD gives a lot of money to fair housing partners, to enforcement partners, so that directive applied to those partners. A couple other executive orders that are important. There was one that was issued this year. This executive order was issued in June 2020, or 2022. It strengthens the equality and support for LGBTQIA in homelessness and housing in particular. During the pandemic, there were a lot of questions associated with appropriate housing for people based on their gender identity, transgender status, sexual orientation in homeless shelters, and some changes in funding for shelters that don't have bathrooms associated, that have bathrooms for all or bathrooms attached to certain units. So that's definitely been evolving over time. The funding's following a more progressive way of housing people in shelter situations. This executive order also directed HUD to provide technical assistance, which is partially what this is today, to providers so they better understand the new coverage. And then this last one in 2021, this is a broader executive order that directed all federal agencies to take actions under federal statutes that prohibit sex discrimination. So this was less directed at HUD and really a broader executive order to infuse equality and LGBTQIA equality into all federal agencies. And last but not least, the Supreme Court decision in 2020 that led to all this, the Bostock versus Clayton County. It's a pretty interesting case, and it's pretty easy to read if you all are into that, and you might want to take a look at it. I would certainly recommend you. Bostock is the name of the first case, and this was an employment discrimination. All three of them were employment discrimination cases. So what happened is that a gentleman was fired by Clayton County, Georgia, because he played on a gay softball team outside of work. He sued. And he sued, and then there were a couple other cases that then came together, were rolled up at the Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court level. And the question was, does sex include gender identity and sexual orientation? And there's an interesting logic exercise that some of the Supreme Court justices go through to try and answer that question. And they actually it's kind of like one of those you did in like 5th grade in school, where they have, if I discriminate on this basis, do I have to consider sex? Yes, sex meaning gender. If I discriminate in this way, do I consider sex meaning gender? Yes. And they literally cross it out, yes, no. And they concluded, the majority of justices, not all the justices, concluded that if I'm discriminating against somebody based on their gender identity, I have to consider gender, I have to consider sex as part of that discrimination. So that's that third bullet there, and it's kind of interesting logic. This, even though it was an employment case, it was a civil rights civil rights decision that then came into play under the Fair Housing Act through those executive orders and the HUD rule that I just discussed. So I will hand it back over to my colleagues, and happy to take any questions at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Heidi. Jessica and I are going to dive a little bit more into what does this look like for all of us as planners in our day-to-day lives. This first section, we're going to be talking about inclusive communication. Language is always evolving. It also means different things to different people. So this section is really about how to navigate potentially unfamiliar conversations and be more inclusive as well as intentional about the communication and language that we're using. For us as planners, it's important to think about the language we use and how we engage diverse groups throughout our community. This first page is a list of common LGBTQIA plus terms. You'll notice this is not all of them, and this is also not all of the definitions that folks use to describe these populations. So as I mentioned, these words certainly mean different things to different people. You can think of lists like this as a starting place to provide a basic understanding of the spectrum of identities that do exist within the population. This basic understanding can help you engage in productive conversations, and it can also help you in being an active participant in creating safe environments for all community members that maybe have some of these identities. And I do want to mention that all of these slides will be available after the conference, and eventually the HUD tool will also be available on HUD's website once it's completely rolled out. This next piece is really about pronouns and honorifics and avoiding assumptions, two big parts of having inclusive conversations. So on the first side, we have pronouns and honorifics. Everyone has them, everyone uses them. These are things like she, her, they, he, him. We use these words to refer to one another, to talk about one another, and just in our daily conversations. I think a lot of times when this topic comes up, people are afraid of saying the wrong thing. So a big part of the modules that we've put together is recognizing that mistakes are going to happen and what to do if they do happen. You know, if you accidentally refer to someone using incorrect pronouns, you need to apologize, move on with the conversation, and learn from that mistake. Sometimes calling undue attention to the mistake can cause just as much harm as the mistake itself. So you just want to apologize, move on, and if you need to talk to the person later privately, that's fine too. We also have some gender-neutral honorifics up on the screen. You can use these, in emails and conferences, public meetings, anywhere that you would typically use honorifics, like in a formal setting. A big part of using pronouns and honorifics is avoiding assumptions. So you should never really assume someone's pronouns, their sexual orientation, their identity based on their appearance alone. Instead, we invite you to politely ask if the person is comfortable sharing their pronouns with you. Another important thing to note is that you can provide opportunity for folks to share their pronouns in meetings, public hearings, things of that nature, particularly if you're in a position of power. If you're running the meeting, if you have a new staff member and you want to invite folks to share their pronouns and things like that, you can be sort of the conduit to have that conversation. And when in doubt, you can use gender-neutral pronouns like they. Again, assumptions not only reinforce stereotypes about gender expression, but they can also contribute to discriminatory language, behavior, and practices. So overall, they can just be harmful to individuals. And probably most importantly, we have some things that you should just avoid making assumptions about this population and asking about overly intrusive questions about people's bodies, their hormone status, medical conditions that they may have, familial status, or potential surgeries. These questions are intrusive, inappropriate, and often harmful. If you take anything away from today, I think it's this slide, and it's a commitment to learning. I think, as I've mentioned a couple times, language is always evolving and can mean different things to different people, and so you want to be mindful of the language you're using so as not to harm others, and come at this from a place of learning. There are a few terms up on the screen that at one point in time may have been considered progressive, and we now have better words for those populations. But I do want to mention that it varies. So you should always respect the language of individuals that they use to define themselves and give them the power to do that and respect that. I believe that if we all just come at these conversations from a place of learning and also mutual respect, that goes a really long way in this commitment to learning. This next section talks a little bit more about avoiding discrimination and gives some examples of what this could look like in your community, and gives you some best practices for non-discriminatory business operations generally. These are two more studies. I know Heidi already shared some data. There was a survey in 2013 that HUD performed where they found LGBTQIA plus people are less likely to receive positive results when applying for housing. This same survey found that 11% of people have been evicted for their gender identity, and that homeownership rates are lower among transgender populations. A 2020 UCLA study compared same-sex couples with different-sex couples and found similar disparities that they were facing in housing and discrimination. I do want to note, and we're all aware that not all discrimination is intentional. Our internal subconscious biases run deep and they impact the way that we interact with others in the world. There are two types of very intentional discrimination that I wanted to cover today. First being very explicit discrimination where there's direct evidence that something has occurred. The other version is circumstantial evidence, and this is typically where differential treatment comes in. So in the first example, explicit discrimination, it often takes the form of facially discriminatory policies, a policy that explicitly treats members of a protected class, in this case LGBTQ folks, less favorably than they do to other folks. This could be verbal or written discriminatory statements, this could be discriminatory rules and policies, and these are really about housing, but they would apply to the planning world as well. Circumstantial evidence are things that are indirect and evidence supporting a conclusion that something did or did not occur. As I said, this often refers to differential or unequal treatment. Heidi provided some examples of this in, steering, maybe providing more information to a prospective tenant who is straight or cisgender than those who are LGBTQIA. And I want to make it very clear that differential treatment can be just as harmful as the explicit discrimination that we just talked about. Finally, some practices that we can all use to avoid discrimination. First is engaging in ongoing learning and training. So this is going back to that commitment to learning and the evolution of language. Second is developing cultural competence. There are a lot of definitions of cultural competence, but the one that really stands out to me and speaks to me personally is that high levels of respect for and knowledge of other cultures, actively working for and with diverse groups. And I think the reason I like this definition is that word actively. It takes effort to be culturally competent, right, and to work with these different groups. But I think it's something that we as planners should all strive to do. Second, I just mentioned this on the previous slide, stay aware of unconscious biases that you hold. And particularly if you're in a position of power, provide training and opportunities for employees and staff to get training on this topic. Finally, non-discriminate marketing, images, and language are extremely powerful in our culture, so keeping in mind that you shouldn't make it seem like there's a particular type of person, couple, family, whatnot, that should be living in your community, owning a home in your community, renting in your community. A really good place to start is by looking at your community's definition of family or household and seeing what that definition reads and if it's in alignment with some of these new terms. Finally, engaging in affirmative marketing strategies to attract diverse communities, particularly to public hearings and opportunities for input where decisions are being made. Affirmative marketing can be really powerful in planning, as we all know. And really just making it very clear that you have an inclusive culture overall is really the goal of all of these things, and making sure that everyone feels like they're welcome at the table. With that, Jessica's going to talk a little bit more about some very specific things that you can do.
Okay, well, thank you all. So with this toolkit that we're doing for HUD, each of these sections really are building on what you're learning before, but they can also be used in isolation. And in this particular part of the toolkit, we're going to be really walking through what are ways that you can develop inclusive housing practices to support LGBTQIA+ people. And so, really making sure we're talking about the day-to-day things that a housing provider, or we'll talk a little bit about what planners can do to just consider being inclusive and supporting all members in your projects and in your housing. So one of the very first basic, easiest, free ways for you to do this is to just use the Fair Housing logo. This is something that you can pull from HUD's website, and it really shows community members and people that you have a commitment to fair housing. Using it in your brochures, using it in your flyers, making sure that you have it on your website, but really showing the community that this is something that's important to you, that you understand what all of that is included in the Fair Housing Act. And again, it's one of those very easy, simple things that you can do to kind of start to create an inclusive community. One of the next things that we are encouraging, housing providers or even businesses to do is to create a fair housing policy statement. So really a great fair housing policy statement, particularly for people who are, as we're thinking about LGBTQIA plus people, making sure that you're including the federal laws that are within the Fair Housing Act. Talk about your organization's policy on housing discrimination. Include those very specific LGBTQIA plus protections. And then, thinking about that periodic training that you're providing to employees. So we have an example that'll be in the toolkit. So at our organization, we take the Fair Housing Act and non-discrimination seriously. It's our goal to provide equal housing opportunity to all individuals. We do not discriminate, deny housing availability, or evict individuals on the basis of race, sex, sexual orientation, perceived or actual gender identity, religion, or national origin. We provide periodic training to all employees who oversee rentals and housing to ensure that they are in compliance with the Fair Housing Act and our non-discrimination policy. And this is something that you can put in your employee handbooks. This can be for your tenant handbooks if you're working in a rental facility or rental property owner. But, having this as sort of like your statement to continue that and reinforce that you are an agency that cares about fair housing. One of the next ones that we've really tried to drill in is inclusive forms. And this is something that as we talk about language, the ever-evolving language that happens with all different communities, our forms should be evolving and adapting. And so, one of the things that this is a HUD product, and when you're in housing, you often have to apply for housing and put your name and put your pronouns and put all these things on there. And we're actually saying that, if you have to collect this information, make sure that you're using the right pronouns, you're using the right words. What are some of the types of things that you could be asking? Just first name, last name. What's someone's preferred name, what are their pronouns, but really not asking about gender identity, sexual orientation, someone's marital status, or familial status. You'll get yourself in a lot of trouble if you start asking some of those questions. It's better to just avoid it, and if you don't have to ask anything, then just don't. I think making sure that you allow people to answer questions that they want to answer and not answer questions that they don't want to answer is really going to be part of creating an inclusive environment, not just for LGBTQIA plus people, but everybody. And so another couple of things that we're going to be talking about is just an inclusive culture. This is true, again, for all protected classes under the Fair Housing Act, but really thinking about hiring a diverse staff that represents the diverse people that live in your community or the diverse people that you're serving. Also partnering with local organizations like LGBTQ plus organizations to get feedback. So thinking about how can you have organizations come to your properties, spread awareness. And then also talking about the visual displays. And we talked a little bit about that before, but making sure that your imagery and your flyers, your brochures, all of those things are inclusive of all different types of people. And then lastly, making sure that you have policies and norms that combat harassment. And so all of these things are really part of creating an inclusive environment and making sure that anyone who's in your property or housing programs feels welcomed. But lastly, we're going to talk a little bit about how to report discrimination. So unfortunately, even though we have all this lovely training that we're going to be providing, we do recognize that discrimination is potentially going to happen still. So this part of the toolkit is really going to be talking to people who have faced discrimination or property owners that, really want to make a report on behalf of someone. But really just making sure that people have the tools that if they do feel like they face discrimination, they know where to go. So one of the first things that we'll talk about is connecting to HUD. You can always file a complaint, through HUD's phone numbers or go online, file a complaint. And with those new executive orders that came out, they have to investigate and look and see if there actually is discrimination based on sex, which now includes sexual orientation and gender identity. You can also file a complaint with state or local fair housing agencies. So there's a lot of communities that have civil rights organizations that do housing discrimination. Some of them are contracted directly with HUD to do these types of investigations, and so you can always contact them. And then lastly, making sure that you can connect with private housing organizations. So they might be able to speak to landlords, maybe do investigations, but also help people file complaints with HUD. So we didn't talk a lot about what's in the Fair Housing Act in terms of the legality piece of it, but one of the things that we really want to highlight is this non-retaliation protection. Voicing that you feel like you've been discriminated against can sometimes be really scary, and people may feel uncomfortable. And it's important to know that under the Fair Housing Act, that any form of retaliation by a housing provider is prohibited. It's under a particular Section 818, but it is unlawful to retaliate against any person if they've made a complaint, testified, assisted, or participated in any manner in proceedings under the Fair Housing Act. So retaliation can get overlooked, especially if you really aren't familiar with fair housing laws. And, you all are in this world, and half of you kind of were aware of it. I mean, the average person is probably even less aware of all of their rights. So, having this in here is really to educate people on what does retaliation look like. So we have a few examples. If a tenant alleged that their landlord raised their rent because they refused to engage in a relationship with him, after filing a complaint with HUD, the tenant began to receive threats from the landlord that they'd be evicted for being a troublemaker. Or after being denied access to an on-site facility because of his gender identity, a tenant files a complaint with HUD, and then after the management company learns about the complaint, they change the tenant's lease conditions and now has to pay a $50 parking fee. Those are both illegal, cannot be done. That's considered retaliation, and so that is protected under the Fair Housing Act. The difference between fair housing complaints and landlord-tenant disputes. There's a difference between being discriminated against and then having kind of interpersonal disputes with landlords. So we talk a little bit about fair housing discrimination, when a provider prevents someone from renting or buying based on those protected characteristics. So race, religion, sex, all the ones that we talked about prior. But landlord-tenant disputes, really a lot of those are like non-payment of rent, security deposit issues, lease conditions, maybe cleanliness of a property. And those are disputes, and they don't necessarily fall under the Fair Housing Act. But if the landlord does engage in any of those disputes based on one of the protected characteristics, then that would be housing discrimination, and you could file a complaint under the Fair Housing Act. So it can get a little muddy, but reach out to those different organizations. They can help you kind of navigate. Is it really discrimination under the Fair Housing Act? Is it a landlord-tenant dispute? Okay, what you all were here for. How does this relate to what you do? Julia mentioned earlier my experiences in homelessness and working with adults who are experiencing homelessness. My background is in social work, so I don't do what you do every day, but all of these things that we talked about are related to any one of our professions. Making sure that we're using inclusive communication, whether you're a planner, a social worker, a housing provider, that's a great way to be inclusive and make people feel welcome. Avoid assumptions. We talked a lot about this, but making sure that you're asking people their pronouns or not making any snap judgments based on any unconscious biases that you have. Continue to engage in ongoing learning, using your images, making sure everything's inclusive. You can use the Fair Housing Act logo in yours as well, and then creating that culture at work And then there are some very specific books, reports as planners that really will walk you through how to make sure you're having an inclusive community, particularly for LGBTQIA+ people. So lastly, the toolkit's going to have a lot of different opportunities of existing trainings. One of the coolest parts about the toolkit, there are going to be scenarios. So there'll be characters walking you through kind of like what discrimination looks like and how to go about correcting it. And so it'll be an opportunity to be used in offices or even in your staff training, but all of these things are available now, and you can just look on the HUD Exchange for all of it. Okay, so we'll take questions.
Hello. I did also want to say that the toolkit is still under development, so a big part of why we're sharing this with you all today and why we're here is we want to offer you all to provide us any thoughts on what you would like more of in this toolkit, less of, or different, and we'll also take questions, obviously. Over here.
So the process of reporting discrimination, there's kind of like this kind of black hole of like lack of information. Even when we give people the HUD's number or CCRD's number, there's a lot of apprehension because they can't afford a lawyer, or there's one lawyer in town, one fair housing trained lawyer for the city of, $500,000, and his whole caseload. If this toolkit could address what you need to document, this is very hard to prove. So helping people learn what to document, how to document it, how long the process might take, whether they should or shouldn't have a lawyer. I mean, I feel like giving people the number to call to complain isn't enough. They need to know how much is this going to disrupt their lives and what support do they need. And as a city person, what support should we provide for that?
I'll hand it to Jessica to respond from the federal perspective, but I just want to make sure that everybody knows she referenced CCRD, which is the Colorado Civil Rights Division, which I think was one of the first, if not the first civil rights division to be formed to respond to civil rights complaints. In Colorado, we work a little differently than in some of the other states in which we work, in that CCRD, we in Colorado, the Denver Metro Fair Housing Center is a fair housing enforcement entity. In states of our size, we would typically see maybe a nonprofit version of that operates statewide, or you see a lot more fair housing advocacy organizations. So Texas would be an example where there are many, and there's a lot more of that. I would say not only advocacy around fair housing, but it's obvious the path of who I go to, and the comfort level of working with those types of nonprofits is just more institutionalized. Those organizations have been around a long time. So I would say even though CCRD's been here a long time, they do a wonderful job. We've worked closely with them on some predatory lending research. We don't necessarily have the infrastructure that you might see in comparable states, and I do think that kind of muddies, the experience from the residents' perspective, because they don't necessarily have a go-to landlord-tenant advocacy organization. The Colorado Center for Law and Policy, I think, is doing more of that, but they're not a fair housing organization per se. So I think we're building that infrastructure, and it should get better in this state, but the funding just hasn't been there in the past to really do it like we've seen elsewhere.
And I would say from a federal level, a lot of this is due to funding and kind of understanding what all of the processes are. Many of you probably know, as each administration comes in, there are big changes to some of the things within these offices, kind of how they get funded, what's their priority. Currently with the Biden administration, there's a lot of emphasis on that. That's why I think we're seeing toolkits like this coming out, things like, making sure that people have access to information. But that was different from in previous administrations. So certainly we'll take the feedback back. I think you're right. It is very complicated, and as we've been going through this toolkit, the Office of General Counsel, which is basically like all the lawyers and powers that be at the federal level, have been scrutinizing every word we put in the toolkit and making sure that we are being really compliant with the legalese. And so, putting things like, I think Julia went in there before, but, like how do you prove this? So there's a little bit in there. This is obviously not the full toolkit. It's about, it's like probably 15 pages at this point. But there's a little bit in there. But I do think that there probably could be more. I don't know if we'll get more in there, but I certainly hear you. And I think at a local level, it sounds like maybe there's some hope for something like that. I don't know how much hope there'll be for at a federal level, but we'll certainly try to make sure we can add things in there to point people in the right direction. So thank you for that. Any other questions or thoughts? I'll say go ahead.
It's more about the executive toolkit. Is there any way that you can include messages and examples in different languages? I closely work with the Spanish-speaking community, and two sides of my brain, that when I speak English, like, okay, this is language, but then I need examples in other languages or models to be like, okay, this is the right way to do it, or...
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And as we continue to work on the toolkit and a couple of other things that are coming out of the FHEO office, translation of all of these products has been a big conversation. So not just Spanish, but in other languages. And obviously, many of you may know that as, federal government, you have to have a language access plan, and you have to do all this 4-factor analysis at your local level. So HUD has to do that too. So there are certain languages that they're required to make sure they're translated for. I don't know if they'll come out all at the exact same time, but that has certainly been a conversation and something that is top of mind for everyone who's creating the toolkit.
We'll pass out our cards at the end. I think particularly Jessica's would be interesting for you all to have. I'm assuming she has cards, or we'll pass our information around. I'm old school. But along those lines, I do feel this comment made me think about there's certainly differences in cultural understanding, particularly if you've come from another country where you may not be able to have been open about your identity. I feel like the next step in this toolkit would be ensuring that it is speaking to any different cultural interpretations as well. We hadn't had a lot of conversations about that yet, but as these materials roll out, I anticipate that there will be hopefully maybe some more resources, along those lines, because HUD is really good. I worked with Jessica's organization, do fair housing training many years ago, and I did find, honestly, HUD very responsive to comments from the field and to recommendations. Did you have your hand up again? Anybody have any questions about all the executive orders or cases? Everybody understood it. It took me a long time to figure that out. Thought it was kind of convoluted.
So one of the things with this toolkit that I've been really excited about, making sure that there's a diverse group of people reviewing it. That might seem obvious to all of you, but in HUD world, sometimes that's a little like nuanced and it feels like it's cutting edge. So the toolkit really has been going through legal review, but it's also been going through, HUD has what they call FedQ. It's a group of employees within HUD who identify LGBTQIA+. They are reviewing all of this and making sure that everything that we put in here is not going to cause additional trauma or harm for people. I kind of mentioned at the end, we're creating scenario-based videos, which are characters. So we're going to try to do this from an animated perspective. And so that group is looking at it to say, like, please don't perpetuate stereotypes in your characters. And so I think the process has been one where just having a diverse group of people take a look, and then people, we're actually kind of practicing what we preach in a very small way, right? Making sure that there's a diverse group of people to review a product. So that's been a very exciting part of the process. It's making it a little slower. That's why we don't know when the toolkit's going to be ready. But it's important and it's necessary, so.
I am curious if anyone has any thoughts about some of the inclusive language we used or anything that didn't sit well with you, anything you think we could have done better. Again, we're just really trying to make sure that this is being reviewed by as many eyes as possible and make it the best that it can be so that it can speak to every different population, you know, not only the populations that fully understand this and are part of the community, but also populations that come from different cultures who use a native language that's inherently gendered. How does this translate to those different populations? And I would also offer, you know, if you all have any examples of how your community is implementing inclusive language or in your programming or in your public hearing, your outreach, your notices, anything like that, I would also be thrilled to hear about that.
I think there's a tremendous need for that. Two observations. When we did the assessment of fair housing training with Jessica's organization, and this would have been 2015, 2016, we were training state, government, public sector housing planners, or people who oversee housing grants, as well as local planners. But it was fairly housing focused, not as much land use and zoning focused. And we routinely had people cry in the training saying, there is absolutely no way I can bring this to my boss. Or, not routinely, but it wasn't uncommon, I should say, not everybody cried. I can't bring this to my boss. I don't think I can do this because city council will feel like this is government overreach, or I'm not going to be able to complete this study. And HUD heard that. I mean, we definitely, it was an opportunity for us to have some pretty thoughtful conversations about how to tailor training, technical assistance, and the requirements and enforcement of those to a community. And I do feel like HUD respected that. But what it really revealed is there needs to be better support of staff and certainly training for elected officials so that they understand some of the things that they say may be violations of the Fair Housing Act, or just even, kind of more positively, how to be more inclusive and how to lead more inclusively. There's a woman out of Baltimore who does a training called Factuality, I think, and it is a board game that she's doing virtually now, but she used to come into communities and play out scenarios, and it's very cool. She does it mostly for the corporate sector, like big corporations. She travels all over and does this. You can look at her website, and I think it's really cool. I did like a little example of that. I have promoted that to planners, to city managers, where I thought it would be useful for city council staff to go through. City council, not necessarily staff, to go through the training, and I have had no success, like zero interest. But I think it's one of those things where it's super important. You just need to keep on pushing that cultural competency, that awareness. I feel like if corporate America is doing this, or some segment of corporate America is doing this, then surely public sector leaders need to be embracing it. And that was kind of the hook. But it hasn't worked so far, but I feel like it's still something, I totally agree with you, something that's very, very much needed.
I'll let
So this will be on the HUD Exchange, which is online, available to anybody. The other thing is that, so this particular toolkit is focused on the protected characteristic of sex, but there are other training tools that are on the HUD Exchange and more that will be coming that my office or my organization's working on. Some for elected officials and direct service, and staff in planning departments. So there'll be some in the future coming for those groups, but there's also things on service animals for realtors and landlords. There are things about familial status that are coming out. So there's going to be, again, this is kind of my comment from depending on the I probably shouldn't say that, but depending on who's in office, on how much information is out there, and I will tell you, everybody is keenly aware of the election, and things are coming out in rapid speed, and so you're going to start to see a lot of products, hopefully coming out before any potential changes in our presidency, so that at least there's some tools out there that this existing administration can get out. So There will be more. Just point them to the HUD Exchange. In the search tool, just put fair housing. Everything will come up. So.
I hear clapping from next door, which I think means we're about at time, but I do want to thank you all for coming to our session today. And I want to highlight something that has come up a little bit, and if your employer's supporting your continuing education or supporting you in general in front of elected officials and things like that. If you are in a position of power where you can provide that training to your staff or create space for these discussions to happen, I think that's very important. Even if you don't think that this applies to you, I can assure you it applies to someone on your staff. And by you creating the space for that to take place, it takes the responsibility off of that person to always be the one creating the space, which can be really exhausting. So thank you all again for being here today, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.